art lovers once again, and in this week we're going to be painting this beautiful overhead view peony bud that I took photograph of myself. So in this video I'm going to show you the process and the steps I took to paint this flower, but if you would like to follow along and have access to a full step-by-step tutorial, then this tutorial is available on my Patreon, where I upload new tutorials every month. So for this project we're using beautiful pinks. So first main pink is Permanent Rose. Second color is Quinacridone Red, and that is a perfect color for the outer petals of this peony bud. You can see there are some reddish tones on some of the outer petals. I'm also using Rosemary Lake, which is also a pink color, but it's a little bit more saturated and stronger, so I will be using it for the center of that peony bud. Also, we need some really dark tones for the darkest parts in the center of the flower, so for that I'm using Rosemary Lake and I'm mixing it with some Perlene Maroon to get this really deep dark red with some pink undertones. So per usual, I start most of my paintings with base layers that I apply using wet on wet technique. So now this flower is very detailed and has a lot of overlapping petals. And since it doesn't have very bright white highlights, we can apply a one big layer over entire flower head, ignoring every individual petal. And that is gonna give us a really good start to building those tonal values. So once that color is applied, I clean my brush, take the water out, and I sweep through the areas that I want to keep lighter. So those would be our highlights of a flower bud. So if you noticed, most of those highlights are on the edges of each petal. And even though you can't see, I am cleaning my brush after each sweep. In order to collect color, you need to keep your brush always clean. So now, once you let that layer dry completely, we will start building tonal values. And if you've seen my other videos, you know I always say that when you paint with watercolors, you have to keep your layers very transparent and watery and build those tonal values very gradually if you want to achieve luminosity and very clean and bright layers and have this depth that watercolor can create when you paint an object, and especially if you want to paint something looking very realistic. So you can use stronger pigments when you paint with wet on wet technique, meaning when you wet the paper first and then apply the color, because that pigment will get diluted and you won't have such a high risk of getting your pigments and colors muddy on the paper. But when you start layering colors with wet paint on dry paper, you want to dilute your pigments, make them more watery and more transparent. And patience is the key, and if you want your painting look light yet very deep and dimensional, you have to stack those layers very gradually, one on top of each other. So that's what I'm doing right now. I watered my mixes and I'm layering little sections at a time. So now I'm focusing just each petal at a time, glazing over mainly the darker parts and the shadow parts of it, and softening the edges with clean damp brush to keep everything soft and avoid watermarks. Now at this point I am not too focused about the texture of the petals that has those very fine lines. I'm gonna do that a little bit later once I build up some of the tonal values. Now as I was building the tonal values, I realized it's harder for me to understand how dark I need to go until I have those really dark tones. So now it's a good time to paint in the center so that we have those really dark tones in order for us to understand our midtones. So only when you have dark and light, you can understand how dark your midtones have to go. So let's paint the center. I started painting center actually from the shadow parts. So I painted those really dark parts and then glazing over with my Rosemary Lake over entire center section so that those shadows kind of get softened. And that's often a good way to paint when you paint something very small and highly detailed. Those shadows kind of have to create a map for you, and it's easier to understand where is what, especially if you want to see your pencil lines. And if you start glazing over and then building the shadows after, you might not be able to see your pencil mark as well, and it might be very difficult to understand that fine detail. So now that I have the center painted in, I can continue building the tonal values, and this time I start introducing my red tone. So that was the quinacridone red pigment. And so as all the petals are getting a little bit closer to the tonal values that we need, it's really good time to start painting in the shadows in between each petals, so that those shadows would start separating the petals and we would start create this peony bud into more three-dimensional object. So now for the shadow parts, I'm using a little bit stronger pigment and less water and painting with the tip of my brush. And still using the same approach, painting wet on dry, and I soften any hard edges with clean damp brush. So now that the shadows are painted in, the center is painted in, we need to continue building the tonal value, but this time we need to start painting in a way so that we can start creating the texture that these petals have. So if you look close at the reference photo, you can see this very fine linear texture over entire petals. So from now on, I will continue building the tonal values with those very fine brush strokes. So for that, I have to use slightly drier paint. So I don't have that much water in my pigment, so whenever I pick up the color of my palette, I dab my brush on a towel or paper towel to absorb the excess moisture and water, so that I would be left with slightly drier pigment. And so with those quick movements and very tip of my brush, I flicker through each petal in a direction of that petal's natural form. So you do want the texture be in exactly the right direction that you see in a reference photo. It would be a good idea to practice this technique on a separate piece of paper before you start painting on your flower, because you want to make sure you can achieve the right balance of water and pigment on your brush so that you can achieve those very fine brush strokes. So as we're reaching the end, the last thing I usually do for every painting is the dry brush. And as I'm gonna pick up my smallest brush and do the finer last detail and the dry brush, I notice there are some gray tones on this flower, so that it would look more natural. I'm gonna use a little bit neutral tint and mix with a little bit of my pink on my palette, and I'm gonna apply some of those gray tones where needed. Also, we need to darken all the darks. So with this dry brush technique, I'm gonna dry brush entire flower with little brush strokes, and I do a few things with this technique. I darken the tones where needed, I perfect the lines, build up more texture. So basically it's the last step that you do to just perfect everything and put everything in place, and you can focus in a greater detail, because now when you dry brush with those tiny little brush strokes, you put your focus on the smallest of the area of each flower, and so you don't focus it on the subject as a whole but on a tiny area. So you can go now as detailed as you can. This technique is usually something that you can decide how far you want to take it, how detailed you want to go. So while some might spend another 10 or just 20 minutes just perfecting everything, perfecting lines, smoothing the surface, creating texture, darkening darks, just last detail, some might spend hours still doing that, where probably I would be, because I love this technique so much and I sometimes can get carried away and it is a chance that you can overdo it. So you do need to assess your painting every now and then, make sure you don't overdo it or over darken it or over dry brush. I know I said that many times, but this is my favorite technique, and usually when I think that painting doesn't go well, I usually can fix everything and elevate it with this dry brush technique, because if you have uneven layers or watermarks, or you think you just really messed it up, after the dry brush technique usually you can camouflage all the imperfections and put lots of nice detail. So in my Patreon classes, I have a dry brush technique video and class where I explain in greater detail how I use this technique. So if you would like to join our Patreon community and paint with me, then I'll put a link down below in the description box. So I hope that you enjoyed painting this peony bud with me, and in part 2 we're gonna paint the leaf parts of this peony. So if you liked, then thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for the future videos. And if you would like give me any suggestions of the paintings of flowers that you would like to see me paint, then please comment and let me know. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!